Hello. I did a whole Notion page for this, and it was like the only Notion page that I did that actually looks pretty cool. So you know, y'all in luck today. Hi, hello, how's it going? It's Lo. We are, as we all are well aware, in October. And October is the month of very spooky things like ghosts and zombies and vampires and mummies, and if you are conservative, feminists. In light of all of the spooky things going on, and because I had a little bit of time off, I decided to sit down and record a video that I wanted to record ever since I first joined BookTube, which is Feminism 101, or how to become the man-hating, flesh-eating witch of every conservative's nightmare. All jokes aside, I really want to make this video because I feel like the knowledge around feminism and feminist theory isn't as accessible as I would like. I have been studying feminism academically for roughly 7 years now, and I've accumulated a lot of knowledge in this meantime, so I decided to actually sit down and record the same lecture that I do give to my students when I'm TAing, or in study groups when I'm invited, or to give lectures when I'm invited, which is the very basics of feminist theory. What are we going to do here? I'm going to give you a quick overlook and a quick introduction on what is feminism and where to begin studying and reading about feminism. Then we're going to go through each feminist wave, and by that I mean the first, the second, and the third. Also, after I'm done explaining the waves, the main themes, and what people were actually discussing at the time, I will give a lot of reading suggestions for all of you so you can kind of like settle into the whole feminism debacle and try to start to begin to understand a little bit more what feminist theory is, where to begin reading, where to look for more reading, and to actually open up the discussion and make this knowledge as accessible and as simple as I can possibly make it to be. So, with that out of the way, let's begin with the first main principal question of the video. What is feminism? According to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a feminist is a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. This is pretty much all a feminist is, to be quite honest. But the ways in which we approach what equality means and what political, social, and economic equality might mean is very different, because we have many types of feminist thought. Even though feminism largely started in the West, it has spread throughout the entire world, and feminism as an ideology has morphed significantly to accommodate the needs and necessities of different women across different stages of life, different places in the world, different sexualities, different gender identities, and all of that good stuff. If you have never read anything feminist, or if you're just a little feminist baby and you want a place so you can actually understand a little bit more of what feminism is and how a feminist thinks and acts, I have a couple of reading suggestions for you. The first one is We Should All Be Feminist by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This book is also available as a TED Talk for free on YouTube, so you can also check that out. The second book is Dear Ijawele, or A Feminist Manifesto and 15 Suggestions, also by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. The third one is Feminism is for Everybody, Passionate Politics by Bell Hooks. And finally, another basic feminist reading suggestion is Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay. So let's give all of this good stuff a little bit of historical background. Even though there's plenty of evidence of misogynistic activity, even ever since the humans first developed writing and painting, it isn't until the 16th century that we actually start to have a coherent and cohesive body of writing regarding feminism, women's rights, and women's rights to freedom and emancipation. The first recorded feminist scholar, if we can call her like that, is called Christine de Pizan, and she wrote in the late 13th, beginning of the 14th century, beginning to challenge society's views towards women, and specifically towards women education. However, even during the Renaissance, those who would speak about women's rights were few and far in between. It wasn't until the Enlightenment period, with the French Revolution and all that we actually begin to have people systematically analyze the matter of women's rights and women's exclusion more closely and more systematically. With the development of a new form of state and a new form of rule of law, states began developing constitutions that actually granted rights and guarantees to every individual man. I say individual man because usually women were cut off that equation. In fact, one of the major scholars on state, rule of law, and politics of France, Rousseau, actually kind of believed that women were too dumb for politics and shouldn't be included in the list of rights and guarantees anyways. However, because these constitutional freedoms and constitutional rights were granted to men, a lot of women actually started arguing against this sort of exclusion from the rule of the law. And one of the most famous, and this is already a reading suggestion for this pre-wave feminist period, is Olympe de Gouges. Olympe de Gouges wrote a book called The Rights of the Woman. This is the English translation. The original in French, it's actually a play on the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen, but actually her paper was originally titled in French, The Declaration of Rights of the Woman and the Female Citizen. That did not end well for Olympe de Gouges. She ended up in the guillotine, but, you know. After this period, we start studying what we call feminist waves. Usually, feminist thought is divided into what we call three main waves, the first, the second, and the third. And while each one has specific demands that each wave is known for, all of the demands kind of pile up together eventually. And I don't want you to watch this video and be like, oh, so we advanced from the first wave to the second wave because the demands of the first wave were met, so we advanced. And that is definitely not the case. Usually the passage from a feminist wave to another is because of a new breakthrough in feminist thought, and a new breakthrough that indicates that there are more things to be objects of concern and objects of political struggle and political organization. If in the first wave women were after the vote, in the second wave women were after reproductive rights and the vote in certain places. Another thing that I want you guys to take into consideration when we're analyzing feminist wave and feminist thinking is that the divisions between waves is largely arbitrary and is mostly made for our own academic comfort. So this is not like a set in stone division. In fact, it's quite controversial in feminist thinking, but for the sake of being clear and being concise and being easy to understand, I'm going to use this as a tool to kind of identify the main focuses of feminism throughout history. Also, last but not least, all of the books that I'm going to recommend, please read them critically. It is important for you to know that feminism doesn't really like for us to take anything uncritically, so you have to read it, analyze, discuss it. If you don't agree with it, feel free to call me out on Twitter or whatever and just ask me to develop more on certain things that you may or may not agree with. Feminism is to be read critically, and there is no feminism without critical thinking. With that out of the way, let's begin with the first wave of feminism. It is kind of difficult to kind of pinpoint where the first wave of feminism really started. Some scholars say that it began with Mary Wollstonecraft or in the 19th century, or some other scholars said that it began with the suffragettes. However, most scholars are kind of in agreement that the first wave of feminism took place between the mid-19th century to early 20th century. The first wave of feminism was known by its activists, women who wanted the right to vote, and those were called the suffragettes. While the suffragist movement was incredibly important to secure the vote for women and to establish political enfranchisement of literally half of the population, it is actually quite a contradictory period. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are well-known suffragettes in the US, but they also were kind of racist. In fact, it's very well known that at a certain point forward, especially after the end of the Civil War, the American suffragist movement was only concerned with securing the vote for the white women, effectively excluding black people, even black women, from their own activism and their own demands. In fact, this went even far deeper because one of the first men that actively and publicly stated their support for feminists and the suffragist movement was Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist. And by the tail end of the women's suffragist movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony kind of like sidelined Frederick Douglass a whole lot because they wanted to secure the support of the white Southern women after the Civil War. It's a very contradictory period, but we cannot forego this period in feminist history because we're talking about the beginning of what we start to believe and understand as feminism, and the beginning of the feminism both as an academic pursuit and also as an activism. For first wave feminism, I suggest the following reading: Women, Race and Class by Angela Davis. Now, this is a book that I would put somewhere between the second and third waves, but this book actually talks quite extensively about the suffragist movement, the racial tensions, and eventually the racial sidelining that occurred between chapters 2 and 9. So if you're interested in a very critical outlook of this part of history, I would definitely suggest giving Women, Race and Class a look. And for the next books, I would recommend A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, who, by the way, is the mother of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, also known as Mary Shelley. Yes, that Mary Shelley. Don't you love history? It's great! The Enfranchisement of Women by Harriet Taylor Mill. The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State by Frederick Engels. Ain't I a Woman? The Full Speech by Sojourner Truth. And finally, History of Women's Suffrage by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Now, pay attention that this book is kinda really racist, so read this with a grain of salt, more or less like a historical document than an actual, academic pursuit. Now let's go to second wave feminism. Actually, there's also a little bit of contentiousness to where second wave feminism kind of began. Some scholars believe that it began in the 1950s with the publication of The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, and some others believe that it was during the 1960s with the publication of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. But anyways, it doesn't really matter when second wave feminism began. What's really important here is that we acknowledge that second wave feminism actually broadened the discussion of women's rights quite significantly. Second wave feminist demands is what most people will associate with feminist demands to this day. Second wave feminism looked not only at the political and legal aspect of women's disenfranchisement and women's oppression, but also at the cultural aspects of sexism, misogyny, and the cultural mindset that allowed oppression against women to thrive. Second wave feminists talked about domestic violence, marital rape, access to contraceptives, right to abortion. All of those are issues that we still talk quite a lot to this day, and they were brought up by second wave feminists. However, the problem with second wave feminism is that it kind of was centered around a singular womanhood experience, and that singular womanhood experience was a white middle-class woman within the context of the United States and in some cases Europe. The reason being is that there wasn't a lot of nuance in the demands of second wave feminists. Just for an example, when second wave feminists wanted the right to an abortion and they wanted the right to access to contraceptives, women of color were actually being subjected to forced sterilizations. So even though reproductive rights as a spectrum is something that concerns feminists as a whole, there are different ways in which reproductive rights are affected for different women. This kind of internal contradiction of second wave feminism made it so that it fractured into third wave feminism, which we're gonna get to in a second. Feminist scholars usually divide feminist thinking during that time into liberal feminism and radical feminism. Yes, that radical feminism that you're thinking. Yes. I have so many problems with it, but this is not the time or the place. I have a video planned and it's coming out soon. Just you guys wait. But even though that the regular division is usually between those two, I would like to add that during second wave feminism, there was a lot of very interesting production of socialist Marxists and materialist feminists who not only were extremely instrumental for later installments of feminist thought and feminist critique, but they were also doing the job of criticizing feminist thinking at the time that it was happening. So it's actually pretty interesting to note out as well. And as for the suggested reading, I have a couple to recommend. The first one is The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. If you're intimidated by the size of this behemoth, because it's pretty big, read just the introduction. It's really self-explanatory and it's really interesting and very easy to understand. The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. Against Our Will by Susan Brownmiller. Woman Hating by Andrea Dworkin. Please remember that Andrea Dworkin is kind of like a swerve, but not as virulent, so I'd suggest reading her work with a grain of salt, like all of these, but please read her with more grain of salt. This is actually important during second wave feminism, but we need to be careful with her. Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici, Women, Race and Class by Angela Davis, and The Sex Which Is Not One by Luz Irigaray. And now we arrive to third wave feminism. Third wave feminism began roughly in the 1990s, and it can be summarized in a single word: intersectionality. This idea was first introduced by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989, and it states that there are different layers of identity that are integral to the shaping of one's experience of womanhood. Redefining what a woman is might seem like a useless effort, but actually allows for a greater scope of identities and experiences to also be looked by feminism. If we're talking about the experiences of a black, straight, disabled woman, and if we're talking about the experiences of a lesbian, indigenous, able-bodied woman, we're talking about two women, and that is correct, but we're also talking about two women with very drastically different experiences. And these drastically different experiences happen because there's several layers of identity that intersect with one another. And those experiences are so interwoven with themselves that it becomes downright impossible to say what is responsible for what in the lives of those women. Third wave feminism is where we have the most pervasive fracturing of feminist ideas and feminist thinking. This is the moment where we consolidate ideas such as black feminism, decolonial feminism, indigenous feminism, lesbian feminism, trans feminism, and many other types of feminism that seek to address specific problems that arise when we look at a womanhood and women's experiences through the lenses of intersectionality. This means that it's kind of difficult to put forward a very cohesive idea of what third wave feminism is and what third feminism wants. It is also very difficult to put forward a coherent and short list of third wave feminism readings. So it's kind of difficult to really settle down on what texts and what ideas are most central to third wave feminism, because third wave feminism is notoriously difficult to kind of like identify and put inside a box. So I'm just gonna throw at you a bunch of books that I've read that are third wave feminism, and I try to be very diverse with black feminists, with lesbian feminists, with decolonial feminists, many types of feminist thinking that can broaden your horizons and make you understand the different intersections of being a woman and other identities. So, the books that I recommend are Ecofeminism by Vandana Shiva, The Sexual Contract by Carol Pateman, Women, Culture and Politics by Angela Davis, Ain't I a Woman by Bell Hooks, On Intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins, The Invention of Women by Oyeronke Oyeumi, La Guerra contra las Mujeres by Rita Laura Segato, Can the Subaltern Speak by Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, Undoing Gender by Judith Butler, Tisso Junkie by Paul B. Preciado, and Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. This is not by far and wide a comprehensive list of authors and themes, and not even a very deep, comprehensive idea of what feminist waves are, but I really hope that this very quick review of feminist thought and feminist thinking can actually help you develop your own path in the feminist studies and actually help you locate yourself in your readings and look for more diverse authors and really feminize all of your shelves, because feminism is great, and as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says, we should all be feminists. If you have questions, suggestions, if you want to discuss feminism thinking, and if you want to discuss specific texts, I'd be so happy to talk to you. Y'all can find my social media in the description box below. I'm also going to add a PDF of the Notion page that I created for this, so you can actually read a little bit closely and understand a little bit more what I tried to convey in this video. But yeah, this was today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys the next time. Bye!